Okay, listen.
Who picked this book, Sarah?
I think I did. And look, I'm not ashamed.
Sarah,
I
loved
it.
it.
Again.
I loved it.
Okay, but listen. The number of times in this book where I resisted going to Google.
I mean,
no, listen, I still haven't Googled it. It's
because
too...
look, this is the book equivalent of like, I have an extra stomach for dessert. That is the science at work here.
Oh my God. No, but oh my God, that's so perfect. I think we could just end. First of all, that is absolutely the show title.
Oh, God.
Second of all, I have so many things I want to talk about. But also, like, I resist. Like, I don't want to look it up.
Well, because I think I've explained the science already. Okay. Welcome to Fated Mates, everyone.
I'm Sarah McLean. I read romance novels, and I write them.
I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor.
And this week, we're talking about Lisa Valdez's Passion.
Which, okay, one of the things that's great about Amazon, if you are a longtime Kindle user, is it's going to tell you when you ordered this book.
You read this on Kindle?
I read this on Kindle in 2010. I never read this in paper.
Okay, well, I can do one better because I have a first edition.
Ooh.
2000, Rebecca Romney. She missed this one for the catalog.
I mean, it's an amazing
I have a first edition print copy of this book, which I bought in 2005 because it was on a shelf in a bookstore. And I was like, oh, a new historical author. Which, those of you who are out there who are not writers and read books before ebooks know that, like, there was a moment there. Every person was just looking for, like, a new historical writer around then.
Well, you found one.
Woof.
Well, and you know what's interesting? So can I ask you a question before we talk about the book itself? Mm-hmm. Do you, Lisa, so in my Kindle, this is organized as the Passion Quartet, but only two were written. And it doesn't look like there's many other, like there's like one other book. So do we know anything about Lisa Valdez?
So Lisa Valdez is a little bit of a romance mystery.
Okay.
She's somebody who comes up in conversation a lot because of Passion, and we'll talk about why. And I should say, let me also say, you guys, I don't save every book that I have ever bought. So this book has moved multiple houses with me. It went to graduate school with me and came back. I mean, it has taken a ride with me. And so on the one hand, there is the kind of like interest in Passion as a text of the genre, which we'll get to, because it is, no matter how you feel about the science of it, it is certainly a moment. It marks a very specific kind of change to historicals, in time. But it also was a huge thing in traditional romance for this kind. Now, don't send me letters. I am not saying erotic historicals did not exist before Passion. What I am saying is that erotic historicals were not like on the shelf at Walmart before Passion. And so it was one of these things that when it came out as a reader, I can remember being like, I've never read anything like this. This is something completely different. My understanding is that the writers in the genre were also like, what is this? Like, how is this going to change things? And I think it sold very well. I mean, we all kind of read it at some point, right?
Yeah, it just feels like
it's in the zeitgeist.
Yes.
And so, but Lisa Valdez was a mystery. I mean, there's a photograph on her website. Mm-hmm. She wrote Passion, and she teed up, as many of us do, patience in the epilogue of Passion. And so we were all like, give it. where is this other book? Because this is bananas, but I want more, right? And then she kind of disappeared. And she disappeared for years.
I might have read Passion when Patience came out.
Patience is heavily BDSM, like heavily.
Yeah.
Like super dom sub. And what's interesting about it is that over the course of time, and all of this is hearsay. So I'm just going to tell you like what you hear when you ask. But it doesn't mean anything. And Lisa Valdez, if you are out there and you are listening and you want to come on Fated Mates, Jen and I haven't talked about this, but I feel I speak for both of us when I say come on Fated Mates and talk to us about whatever you want to talk to us. And correct the record if you would like. But what you hear is that the response to Passion was so incendiary. Like it was either, holy crap, this is amazing. I've never read anything like it. Where's I want more? Or from the kind of old school, you know, the historical readers and writers who we still hear about when we talk about like things that would never happen in history, which we know is bunk. I mean, it's just wrong. The perception of history as being without sex, without scandal, without, you know, women who do things that are, you know, revolutionary and, you know, and sex. Well, there might be a biological problem with the sex here, but that's a different thing.
A different thing entirely. Right. Absolutely.
But that sort of school of historical reader / writer apparently really came for this book. I don't remember. I wasn't writing at that point. So for me, it was literally just like, where's the next one as a reader? But what I will tell you is that since then, I have seen romance come for books. And I have seen in real time what it can do to an author's mojo.
Yeah.
And I think that it is. And so what you hear often is that she took a long time to write Patience because she was in her head about Passion and the response to Passion. And that sucks.
Yeah.
And if you were one of those people, you should write her a letter or something and tell her you're sorry. Don't write her a letter. She doesn't want to hear from you. But you should say out loud into the universe here in January of 2022 that you're sorry.
Patience came out in 2010.
Yes. It came out right after 9 Rules.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I remember this because Patience hit the New York Times list the week that 9 Rules fell off the New York Times list. And I was like, oh, what? Patience? And I ran to buy it.
Of course. Of course. Was this before or after 50 Shades then?
No, it was before 50 Shades. At least it was before 50 Shades was a thing.
Yeah.
I don't know the timeline of Master of the Universe or whatever it was separately.
Well, right, exactly. Okay.
No, but it was sort of post-Twilight, before 50 Shades, and it was heavily, I mean, like, Patience, I did not reread, but as I recall it, it felt like, oh, wow, there's a lot of, like, red asses in this book.
Fair. No, well, I mean, what's interesting is I had the same experience, which is as I was rereading Passion, I was like, I've reread this a couple times. I haven't reread it in years, but Patience has like, I you know, so I'm like, I'm going to reread it.
Here's the thing about this book. We've talked about swinging for the fences, right? Mm-hmm. This book swings for the fucking fence. Yes. And like, we can talk forever about whether or not we think that it like clears the fence, but it's doing a thing that does, because at the time, so paranormal exists. And we know paranormal is getting sexier and sexier. And it's the boom of paranormal at this point. Like, everyone's reading paranormal. You know, buses are traveling around the country carrying paranormal authors everywhere. Like, you can't throw a stone and not hit a, like, massive paranormal property. And there is something very sexy and edgy and I guess, like, wicked about those, like, big paranormal properties. There's, like, a ballsiness to them.
Yeah.
And I think what was happening in historicals is we had sort of come off of the, like, 90s explosion of historicals and all the things that we've talked about historicals doing. But we still, at this point, like, Lisa Kleypas is writing sexy, but she's not writing this. Right?
No.
Nobody's. And remember, Bridgerton is the huge historical property at this time. Like, you can't.
2005 for sure.
Right? In 2005, like, Julia Quinn puts out a book and she sells, 200,000 copies in the first however long. And those books are getting almost less sexy as they progress. Right? Like, she's writing the sort of, like, quieter here, the, like, beta hero, the, like, she's like, really writing a quieter kind of romance.
Yeah. It was fascinating to reread again. I was doing a little digging around, same thing, like, kind of who's Lisa Valdez. And in 2014, there's a piece attributed to her on the website, the blog of author Jess Michaels.
Ooh, it would make sense Jess and Lisa know each other.
Okay. But this again is like 4 years after Patience. And it is talking about like why include sex? Like, sort of like, what is it? And how it basically is like a really strong defense of why it's included and its part in the story, and the idea that you can't just skip it. If you are skipping it, you're skipping the story itself.
Yes.
And it's really rooted in, I think, something I spent a lot of time thinking about was I was reading this book, which was how tightly integrated it is into the story itself.
Tightly.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Anyway, how tightly integrated it is. No, but yes, I think you're 100% true. I also think, like, Lisa Valdez's Passion comes out and, like, lands big.
Yeah.
From Berkeley. Like, it's a traditional romance that's on the shelves at Walmart. It begins with him like groping her at at the World's Fair.
At the Crystal Palace, which I spent a lot of time also looking. Getty Images has hundreds of images of like what that would have looked like.
And like, I think that's it too, right? It's that sort of, imagine walking into a Walmart today and picking a book off the shelf and opening it, and the first line of the book being, his hand held her breast, which is the first line of this book. Like, and you have a moment where you're like, oh no, not only was it doing something different, and in many ways kind of codifying the idea that an erotic historical could exist and could receive the support and, stamp of approval of traditional publishing and by extension historical readers and the historical community. But it was also kind of like blowing the door open and saying these romances can look different. But at the same time, like, and I don't know, there's something going on here because it didn't shift it shifted the genre, I think, in some ways. Like, historical writers often, when we're like quiet talking, right, we'll say like, can I write this in a sex scene, to each other? And often the response is, well, passion. And that's a little glimpse at like what we do on the back end. Also, it never happened, right? Like, this book lives on an island somewhere, right? Like, the traditional historical never went in this direction.
Right.
You think about the sexy traditional historical writers now. I mean, the people who we point to as, like, these people write sexy. Elizabeth Hoyt, Tessa Dare,
Bev
me.
Jenkins, right.
Yeah. I mean, but
not that sexy.
None of us are writing
erotic historical romance, essentially.
Exactly. Traditionally, I just want to say traditionally, because we also have, Kate Pierce and Jess Michaels and Nicola Davidson and, any number of people writing erotic historicals.
But those people are still fighting on a weekly basis the charge that they are ahistorical.
And that's all happening largely. That's
Yes.
like self-publishing digital. That's happening digitally, but like you just don't see this historical. It's like there was one, and then it crushed it. I mean, like it crushed it. When Patience came out 5 years later, it hit the Times list.
It's also the most overtly like religious text.
Yes, I was thinking. Yes.
She is. I mean, like this could very well be inspirational.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's right. It's like a predecessor. It's like Lisa Valdez walked so Sierra Simone could run.
Absolutely. I found myself thinking a lot about like, look, sexiness comes and goes in waves in romance. And we are at a point in romance right now where I think traditionally published books are there's less sex on page, largely speaking. I mean, again, this is like a generalization.
No,
of course,
true.
we could all find exceptions. And the thing that I was thinking about a lot with this book is that it makes a really strong case. And I feel like, you know, we're constantly like, how do you define erotic romance? Right. And like, so the classic definition, which we've talked about a million times, is you can't take the sex scenes out of the book. The whole plot just like collapses on itself. Like it's a really key part to the plot. Jennifer Porter, who is a librarian and a Twitter user who
an avowed Lisa Valdez fan.
Oh, I'm sure, who says really smart things about romance all the time, has made the point that she thinks that erotic romance is like essentially the movement of the people involved in the relationship are exploring their relationship and deepening their relationship through their sexual relationship.
Yes, I think that's accurate.
I do
we
too.
We also had Nikki on to talk about this, right? Nikki Sloan.
In a good erotic romance, in a perfect erotic romance, the body is just as important as the mind, is just as important as the soul. And what I mean by that is we live in a society where like people will talk all the time about like, I don't know, like their exercise regimens. It's a new year, right? Like I'm a jogger, I'm a runner. I like get on my, what is that?
Elliptical.
Bike,
my Peloton.
My Peloton, right? Like it's perfectly acceptable to be perfecting your body when it comes to like, you know, your health. One of the things I struggle a little bit with is the way that romance still pulls away from like sex as being a legitimate thing that your body does that feels great, that is awesome and fun, and that is like really tied into like many of us, like how do we feel about ourselves is how we feel about our bodies. And that's like both positive and negative. And I think the thing I loved about this book was this feeling that like it leads with their bodies. It leads with them, their physical connection they have. And I know I'm like muddling this. Maybe this seems really obvious, but in a world right now where so many traditionally published romances are like, we're going to just pretend that doesn't exist. That everything instead is like banter, or everything instead is like, I don't know, like what can we like throw up as an impediment to this? The way that Passion and Mark connect physically is ultimately really important to how they connect emotionally.
Yes.
And then in the end, how they connect literally, like they essentially like marry each other in their own eyes in like a field outside her dad's house.
Yep.
Right? Spiritually.
Yep. Yes.
And I think that's it. And I had this moment, like this is a perfect erotic romance because they just stack all up right on top of each other. And there's it's just, I don't know. It's perfect. It's really perfect.
Really great erotic historical. Yeah. It's really great. And I think, you know, what you're saying really is mirrored in the text in a lot of ways. And maybe some of the reason why we were also shocked by it and continue to be shocked by it. Like, I think that if this were contemporary, we would not be shocked by it. Like, and I tell me I'm wrong, which is fine. I'm just saying, like, in historicals, you don't see these concrete nouns, right?
No.
Like, you don't see, I hope everyone's wearing their headphones around children. You don't see, like, cock and clit and,
cunt.
You know, like, cunt. Like, you just don't see it. You don't see sex. I know, I mean, I write it, right?
Right.
I don't don't use these words as liberally as she does. And it's not because I don't know why. I think that's when I was reading it, I was really thinking about like, why don't historicals use this kind of language, which is, I think, it's what would be called coarse, right? Mm-hmm. But there's nothing coarse about the way she uses these words. And there's nothing, in fact, one might argue that her language is really florid. It's like purple almost. Like it just edges up on purple.
But it's also so visceral. That's what I'm getting. Like, and I've said before, I think I've thrown it off. Like you can lead with sex in a book. People don't really do it anymore, but you can. And then they figure out how to be together.
It's incredibly difficult.
But this,
it's so hard to do this. I was thinking about that too. Yeah. Swinging for the fences from page 1, line 1.
Line 1,
right? If you say we're going to start this book and two strangers are going to be having sex in public, in Victorian England, where are we going? For those of you who think about plot, this is an incredibly difficult structure to start with. This is an Act 1 opener that it feels like it is virtually impossible to imagine how you would continue from here as a writer. And Lisa Valdez has it so clear in her mind. She knows exactly what she's doing. She also deftly does. Then, we don't have to talk about this now because we haven't talked about. We have to sort of introduce the book, but she deftly uses the secret baby trope.
Absolutely.
There is a remarkable. It's remarkable because she does. It's it's not there, and then suddenly it's there.
So I don't know. 800 minutes in,
she's good. Maybe this is my other thing. Is nobody ever says, well, maybe she's somebody else.
Yeah,
maybe she. I can't imagine. She's so good at it that I can't imagine she's not writing something.
Well, right, exactly.
The frustration with that always is I don't really admit your pen names or don't admit your pen names, but I just want to know, if you're writing something else, I want to read it.
Just exactly. I don't need to know who you are. I just want to read other books. Just somebody slip me a little DM. Okay. We are far afield. Let's go back and just talk real briefly about the plot. So Mark and Passion are both in the Crystal Palace exhibit. Which
is gorgeous. If you have never looked at pictures of the Crystal Palace, you should.
I'll put a link in show notes. Getty Images has hundreds of them. It's amazing.
You think late stage capitalism overspends? Talk about these World's Fair things where they built whole buildings and then took them down.
Sure. Well, I live in Hyde Park, Chicago, where that happened. So
yeah.
So they essentially run into each other. He is an earl, she's a commoner, and she's a widow. And
but they don't know. Nobody knows. They don't know
each other's names. They don't know who they are. But
there's no reason for them to know each other, right?
Right. That's the other thing, right? The class stuff is really interesting, this book. And they essentially have not just a one-night stand. It's immediately after a meeting, he kind of pulls her behind a screen. They're just there's this electrochemistry between
fated
them.
mates. It's fated mates.
Yes. And they have sex behind the screen inside the literal exhibition of the Crystal Palace. Right?
What?
And they go back and do it every day for a couple of days before he has his brother kind of follow her out to figure out where she lives. And then it's in her bedroom or his, everything is so secret between them because at the same time that this is happening, she's I'm just in London for a couple months to visit. I'm coming out of mourning. Her husband died 2 years earlier. It was a miserable, unhappy marriage. And so she's just visiting her cousin and her aunt while he is being blackmailed to keep essentially a family secret. And it turns out, of course, that the woman he is going to have to marry is Passion's cousin. So the entire time they are having this torrid affair, right, in secret, neither of them knows that they're about to be connected in another way. And it's so visceral. Everything about this book is just... There's no, oh God, this book was great. So I guess we could get out of the way the silly
Do we
part
want
of it.
to talk about sex?
Yeah, almost. Because the part that is, it's really interesting. It's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because it's so...
Of the body.
Yes, but there's this one part. So, basically Mark has the biggest dick of any dick that's ever dicked.
Gigantic.
The biggest dick at boarding school.
Well, I mean, biggest.
Sure.
It seems like biggest dick in pornography too. Like, I mean,
You know
just
what it reminded
gigantic.
me of? In Magic Mike, Big Dick Richie.
Yes.
Who has the same problem? Like, my dick is so big, it can't even entirely get in these.
Yes, and then he finds Andy McDowell.
Sure,
and
the only woman who has a
perfect. Well, there's a poem in Passion that they have, and Big Dick Richie maybe could needs to learn it.
So this is like,
okay.
Anyway.
So, but wait, the poem is basically like, no matter who she is, like when I find the woman who can like fit me, that's the woman I'm going to marry. So they have sex behind the screen in the Crystal Palace, and it's clear he has a very large penis.
Sure.
But like empirically, but like it's just like, okay, here are two people having like, it's large. There's a lot of like door to her womb talk in the beginning of this.
Yes.
We should maybe content warn this part of the I don't know. Like, I don't know what, it feels like a lot. This does feel like a lot. So just, if this feels like a lot to you right now, maybe skip forward a few minutes to the next chapter. Maybe we'll chapter this conversation.
Yes.
So, okay. And then, so then it sort of feels like, okay, well, and then he says to his brother, he goes to his brother and he's like, I fit. And the brother's like, great, that's amazing. I want to meet her. And it's a little bit like, it's sort of charming and funny, and you sort of see the like brothers and their relationship. And then like they have sex again, and then again, and then again, and then again. And then they have this scene where he goes to her home.
Yes.
Like he climbs the trellis. I love a climbs the trellis scene.
Of course.
In the darkness, and like he gets himself into her bedroom, and he's like, where are the servants? And she's like on the other side of the house. And he's like, okay, we're going to do this right, because now we have all the tools at our disposal. Like we have a bed. And he penetrates her. And then it's like he penetrates her beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. It feels like cis woman's anatomy, and I don't.
Where is he?
I'm confused.
In his uterus. It's like he found a little pocket.
Well, there's a pop involved, and I don't like that word.
No.
And so it's like basically like he pops through.
Yes.
Into a pocket of sorts. And then at some point, and look, I've had an IUD inserted, so like none of this is great for me. Like, I mean, I just feel like there's a lot of, it just like anybody who was born with a cervix and has had a, cervical anything knows that like this is not like a comfortable experience for most of us, I don't think. So I think, and then at some point I was like, is he like through in there like as an IUD would be? Or is it outside? And it's confusing and also like not great, but then why am I reading it and why can't I stop? And I have questions, and at the same time she's like, I can feel you like you're another organ. And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening?
It was a lot.
He is like, I've never
been in this far before. Yeah.
Like this is like your body was made for mine, which is what we are. So here's the thing. It's what Jen was saying earlier, what you were saying earlier about the physicality of this book. Like it's not a metaphor. It is they are literally made for each other. She is shaped differently. I mean, this is a not like other girls thing.
My cervix is not like other girls.
Taken to 11. So
11,000.
So I don't get it. I asked on Twitter. Somebody suggested that like maybe she has like a tilted, like maybe there is like a slightly possible scientific thing here. I did put it to Dr. Jennifer Gunther. Like perhaps she would like to give us her analysis of the particular issue. I will keep you all posted if that happens. It really feels like something is up in there. I mean, something is clearly up in there.
See, yeah. You know, well, I will say, okay, so Sarah's right. This is physically how it's described, but I did find myself thinking, like, metaphorically, like, why it is.
I mean, obvious, that's clear, right?
Sure, but, like, why it is, like, one of the things that is so fascinating about romance is, and I think ultimately, like, you know, I get it, like, it's not great, is this idea that you're going to have the best sex of your life only with the person who you're going to, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm kind of like, meh, in real life, I think it's okay to just have great sex with someone and like not spend the rest of your life with them or not have them be like, you know what I mean? And that's, I think, the part I'm kind of like, is this just an example of like romance being like, okay, we're debunking virginity. But, like, what else could we do about this? What else could we do to show?
Oh, that's so interesting because, like, this predates anal is the new virginity.
That's right. There is not a hint of anal sex in this book. And I will tell you, if it was written today, I totally would have expected that. So that's what I found myself thinking. Is that what this was essentially the... I know it's not.
It's like the new virginity.
Cool. Right. It's not super cool to like make a big deal of the hymen anymore. But
well, here's the deal. The hymen's not up in there.
Sure.
In either way, you guys, again, I know that I like to proselytize about the hymen not being where romance likes you to think it is, but it's not there. It's not inside. So, like, essentially, Lisa Valdez has given us like a new hymen.
Sure.
But it's complicated. My relationship to this book is complicated.
You know what's
because
funny
I think I read it for the first time and I was like, this feels weird but fine.
Sure, right.
And now, like, as a 43-year-old who, like, you know, has more awareness of the inside of her body.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this too, right? Like that we talked about this in our bodily autonomy episode, that often historicals especially, but all romance kind of doesn't do a great job. It sort of walks us up to certain places about you know, female body structure, but doesn't give us like a clear understanding is my point.
It often seems metaphorical for like just, you know, at that time, I mean, I think Marrying Winterbourne does a great job of this, where he's literally like, don't women of your class know anything? And she was like, no, not really. It's up to the men to tell us, right? But I mean, I think realistically speaking, that is not something that only existed back then. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm like, we have more abstinence only sort of controlling weird shit we're teaching kids about sex now. And no one is like, oh yeah, but no one knows anything about it. Because like, imagine, sometimes I feel like that talk about historical is like, imagine 150 years from now, people being like, oh yeah, no one knew anything about sex. There was abstinence only education. And you'd be like, no. Right?
Right.
I don't know.
Look, the point is that I still don't understand what's going on up in there in Passion. And also I didn't Google. So it's my own ignorance at work here. I mean, and I think it was Leslie Kelly on Twitter who was like, I just kept thinking, like, how is she carrying a baby if he's just up in there all the time? And I was like, oh my God. Because then, of course, right, so Passion, so now, okay, new chapter.
Right.
Passion had this terrible marriage. And this is like, there is some, you know, old school, like old-timey baby stuff here.
Yeah.
She had this terrible marriage, and she believes she is barren and unable to bear a child because her terrible husband, like, impregnated, like, a milkmaid.
Sure, but not her.
And it wasn't her. But he did not, they did not ever conceive. And so she thinks she can't conceive. So she basically says this in classic historical romance way. She says this as though it is fact. Mm-hmm. And then Mark, the hero, is like, well, that is clearly fact. So he's just like shooting him.
There's so many things that were really interesting to me about this book, right? Because she tells him, like, I can't get pregnant. And he thinks to himself, and, tells, I saw
Which we should say, I can't get pregnant out of the mouth of a heroine in an old school historical means the
I'm
fastest way
absolutely
to
knocked
say
up right now. Absolutely.
Somebody's getting pregnant very fast.
But the thing that I was fascinated by is his internal monologue at that point is, that's actually probably not true, right? It could be that she could still get pregnant but he thinks, I don't want to hurt her feelings by, like, giving her false hope. I mean, there's a part where he legitimately thinks, like, that probably isn't really true, but, I don't really want to, like, make waves. This is going to hurt her feelings if I give her this idea that maybe there's a chance.
That's so interesting. I've read this how many times, and I don't remember that part. Because, he's just coming up in there all the time.
All the time. But that's the other thing. He's, like, not at all concerned that there might be this outcome to this. And especially since the entire side plot of the book essentially is that his mother was having affairs, and his brother is not his real brother. It's his half-brother. Right? She had an affair with the gardener. And so him being so, like, he's not even pulling out.
Extreme laissez-faire on this birth control situation. Anyway, so Leslie, that's a great question about how on earth this is all happening at the same time. But, it's romance reasons.
Romance cervix, I guess.
Romance, human physiology. And so, so here's the other thing that I really think about the structure of this book. The fact that it begins with sex and that the first half of this book is basically them meeting up, not knowing who the other one is.
Right.
And having, like, remarkable sex in public mostly is fascinating to me because it establishes it almost backs into them being, fated mates, right? We are so convinced by the physical response they have to each other that they are right for each other, that, like, the actual emotional love story is backburnered for a lot of this book. And it's kind of wild because you totally believe that they're, like, gaga for each other.
Yes. Right. Even though, of course, it's, like, basically a sex deal, right? He's like, we'll just do it for 2 months until you go back home. I've never really been interested in that long, anybody that long. And you've got to go back home, and your dad's a vicar. So whatever.
Except, like, right away, he's like, where do you live? What's your deal? Who's your dad? Like, it's kind of wild how it works. Like, the actual structure of the characterization in this book is fascinating to me because I would say that I don't think I've ever read another romance novel where I believe the two characters, another, like, erotic romance maybe, where I believe the two characters are, like, made for each other from the jump without basically any conversation. Because they don't talk.
No, they literally just
they stand over the Bible.
Yes.
Which is open to the Gospel of Mark. And her name is Passion because she was born on Passion Sunday.
And I'd like to say she's a deeply religious woman, right? Like, she really thinks a lot about, like, God and her duty and what's moral and...
this is where the Song of Solomon does a whole lot of heavy lifting in erotic, religious romances, because she really believes, like, there's a lot of there's discussion of, like, this is an act of religion, right? This is an act of pious godliness. And I think that's I think it's also fascinating but also it speaks to really great writing, because there are so many places in this book where it could go really wrong.
Okay, so I want to talk about them as characters for a minute, because the way that we essentially, okay, so you're like, how does it work then? How, like, what is the magician doing that makes it work? Because it's obviously like super hot. They're very like in touch with each other's bodies. But the other thing that's happening kind of simultaneously is then when they're not on page together, fucking
Which
behind
is
the screen
a
at the
lot.
Crystal Palace, then what we're seeing is the way in which each of them is broken. So for Passion, it's her. She was really happy growing up and loves her sisters and felt really, but then she marries this man and is unhappy. Oh, that scene's, yeah, we'll talk about that later too. Although I have a theory about that.
I made a face, but it's fine.
But then we have Mark. His mother is essentially doesn't love him. And it's pretty clear to us that she has the second child to love, because Mark is the one who like ruined her. And the other thing that's fascinating, I'm going to tell you, is he is terrible to her. And she is terrible.
So terrible to her.
To the point where I was like, people aren't mean like this on page anymore. Like literally so terrible to each other.
There is a lot. I kept thinking as I was reading it, I had the same exact thought. And she's terrible to him. He's terrible to her. And then the brother, Matthew, who is like beloved by both of them, like loved, deeply loved by both of them, sees the truth, finds out the truth that the mother has been involved in blackmailing Mark to protect his paternity.
Sure.
And goes for the mom.
Yes.
Like, the brother is also very mean to the mom.
Yes.
And you're totally right. And I was thinking the whole time, this book marks that shift, right? We've talked about this like early aughts shift in the way heroes are.
Yeah.
And the way the romance is, like that there is a sort of, you might find a mother who is this mean, but you would never find a mother this mean treated in this manner on page.
Yes. The other part that was really fascinating is Mark loves his brother. Like there is no doubt ever that he does not love his brother, right? But there is this part where he thinks to himself, part of the reason he talks himself into marrying Charlotte, which is like Passion's cousin, right? He's like going to be blackmailed into marrying Charlotte, is he's like, well, I do have to have kids, and Passion thinks she can't have them. So, whatever, that's dead in the water anyway. But he's like, I hate myself for it, but I cannot let the earldom go to like the grandson of the gardener. I mean, and he skips over his brother almost, right? He loves his brother, but he's ashamed of it.
And Mark says it. I'm sorry, not Mark. Matthew says it in the very beginning. He says, "Who cares if Passion can't have children? I'm going to marry Rosalind, his love, right? And we'll have a baby,
right?" And it is fascinating to me that the other thing you see that's very common now, and again, it's I understand why it's happening, is essentially you have people, dukes who don't really care about the dukedom. And you've written this, and that's very believable to me. But here you have someone who is deeply disinterested, actually, in the earldom, but it is still so ingrained in him to care about like that bloodline. And it was fascinating to have these characters be so imperfect.
Can I say something about this bloodline thing, though? Because, I mean, as you know, I really love a bloodlines plot. In historicals, it's really tricky because dukes hold so much power, right? Earls hold the aristocracy holds so much power that there are very, very few plausible conflicts that can like
tear them apart,
at that high level conflicts that they can't get past, right? Because money talks and power talks, and they have a seat in parliament, and like there's truly, like, it is very difficult to imagine, she says, speaking as somebody who's currently writing, like, a series about taking down powerful men. Right? It is very difficult to come up with crimes that are, or infractions that are so bad that they might impact a marriage, or they might impact a happiness factor. So this kind of bloodline thing does kind of, it keeps coming back, because when your power and your privilege and your money and everything rest on like something as simple as paternity.
Yes.
It's really, in many cases, the only thing, except for heavy debt. You would do that. But then you come to readers don't like poor heroes.
So Mark has this like really important reason that he's going to like essentially kowtow to this black male and marry this woman and protect his brother, even though it also means protecting his mother. He's like, I would love to throw her to the wolves, but if I do that, it's going to impact Matthew. But the thing that's fascinating about Passion is she essentially, once she figures it out, and by the way, listen, the scene where she figures it out, I had forgotten. So it's 70 or 75% through the book where she's going out to dinner and she's been invited to Charlotte's house and everyone's going to meet this girl.
You mean where she figures out that he is marrying Charlotte?
Charlotte. And,
it's heartbreaking.
And here's the thing, like, I am so used to like, these the terrible thing finally gets revealed to the characters and they are able to essentially like fake their way through it, like put on their game face and just be upset later. She loses her shit and like essentially
she throws up.
She makes it out of the house, but she is like, I have to leave immediately. She cannot hide what this has done to her. And I loved that too. I loved how like viscerally upsetting it was. And Mark wants to go after her and Matthew's like, you cannot. You are here with this woman you're going to marry. You're going
to ruin this girl. I also really, one of the tropes that this book plays beautifully that I forgot I loved so much is sacrifice for the love of someone else, right? Like, I know you love this person and therefore, like when Passion is like, I'm out, and Mark is like, look, I don't care anymore. I want to marry you. And then she's like, no, but I love, like,
but I love Charlotte.
Like, I love Charlotte. Like, and Charlotte, you're going to ruin Charlotte. And I can't live with that. And then Mark is like twisted in knots or tied up in knots with the emotional baggage of like, he simultaneously will do anything and suffer any indignity and any scandal for Passion.
Right.
But understands that if he betrays Charlotte, game over.
Right, because
with Passion
won't have any part of that.
I mean, it really that storyline only works. That conflict only works in the hands of like a very skilled author, because you have to be able to articulate. You have to make the characters commitment to each other so solid.
Right. Well, and that's the thing I was thinking. I was like, the thing that's amazing about this book, right, as I was rereading it, as I was like, it's going to lead with sex and it's going to be like, but then the like crucible that they are in is one that is created by the bounds of like society and like morality. Mm-hmm. Right? He's bound by society. She's bound by morality and what she's learned, like, with her father and to be a good person. And this is what is the thing that is going to crush them. Right? And the thing that's amazing about that is when it starts, you're like, these two dummies are having sex behind a screen in public. That's going to be what brings them down. Oh no.
No one notices.
That's the thing that worked perfectly.
Yep.
And that is the thing that is so deeply interesting to me about this book is the things that seem most dangerous, right, are the things that are great and perfect and have always worked and will always work between them. But it's figuring out the stuff that is dictated by not in their bodies, right? The other stuff that is going to like trip them up and that they're going to have to figure out. And it is wrenching. It is absolutely gut-wrenching, the whole back end of this book. Because you literally are like, how is this going to work out?
Yeah, and on top of it, she's pregnant.
Yes.
Her father's a vicar. So, like,
Yes.
there's a whole thing where she's pregnant and she says to her sisters, like, I'm pregnant. And they're like, okay, well, we'll go home. Like,
Right.
Because she's like, I can't be pregnant and tell Mark because he'll ruin Charlotte.
Right.
Because he's a noble dude who will want to raise his own child.
Yeah.
And then they're like, we'll go home. And she's like, but we can't really
Because
go
I'll
home
ruin Dad.
because
Yeah.
my father will lose the vicarage. So then it's like, well, maybe we'll go to France.
Yeah, right.
And then there's like, it's very sort of neatly tied up at the end, obviously, everything. But what I really like about this is also you could fall into a very serious trap writing this book where you give them nothing but each other.
Yes.
And both Mark and Passion have a really lovely, network.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, Mark has his brother, which is, enough. But also Mark has a job. Mark has a passion. Yes. He's an architect. And so there just is a real sense of these people being having full lives.
Yes.
With the exception of love, like a fated mate. It's like, It's almost like these two could only have a fated mate. Like a regular mate is totally unnecessary to them.
It's interesting, like, the journey you take with these characters, right?
Yeah.
I will admit that I was kind of like, okay, this is fine. It's just hot, whatever. But then, like, there's a point where you're like, I actually was really like, I dislike Mark. He is such a jerk, right? And then you get to the point where you realize, like, how just emotionally wrecked he has been by, like, the constraints of his life. And therefore, not any regular person is going to be the person who can, like, that's, I think, what you mean, right? Like, someone who could understand his own, like, that harm is going to be the only one who can heal him.
He's like a backup Dane to me.
Yeah.
Like, there's, I mean, there will never be, like, the Marquis of Dane from Lord of Scoundrels is a different kind of everything.
Right.
But, like, there is a real sense of, like, Mark's having been broken.
Yeah.
And again, it's that moment where you realize, like, that's not always believable. Not every writer can write a broken hero and actually make it believable. Where you're not, as a reader in 2021, going,
sure, whatever.
Come on. You're rich, you're powerful, you're handsome. Like, what's your problem?
And that's the thing. I think it's like you really get that instead he's essentially like a high-functioning broken person, right? Yeah. He's like, I figured out a way because of my money and my power and my good looks to, like, live a life where I don't even actually know how miserable I am until the blackmail scheme and this pressure from my mother, this woman who has always hated me, openly hated me. And right. And it's a really fascinating, I think, because so few, like, this, there's true villainy on page in this book, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it's honestly the kind of villainy that I think most people recognize, which is like the casual villainy of people in your own family. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. and a sort of sense of, there's Charlotte's mother is willing to basically do anything to get her child into a new world, right? She's like Cinderella's stepmother.
And, it's funny because we get even two sides of Charlotte. Like, we get Passion's love for her, but Mark's disdain for her. She's too dumb to even realize she's a puppet is what he thinks at first. And it takes him a long time to realize, like, no, she's actually just completely innocent, right? Like, she's the apple in this case did fall very far from the tree. She's nothing like her mother. She can't even, the whole book hinges upon this letter, right? That essentially, his mother wrote admitting that it wasn't, that this Matthew was the gardener's baby. And finally Charlotte gets it and, like, gives it to Mark, not even really having put two and two together. She's like, I'm afraid my mom's going to do something real bad with it. And he is like,
she's like, I didn't even read it. And I'm like, Charlotte.
Right.
Charlotte, read the letter.
And so that's the part I think that's also, it we see like that falling away where he can really kind of like, okay, I can fight my way out of these terrible ways I've been taught to think about women.
Yeah. Well, and at the
right?
very end, he has that moment where he says to Charlotte, like, I'll be your husband.
Right.
Because and it's, of course, in service to passion. It's that he knows
Right.
he'll never win her back if
Right.
Charlotte doesn't agree to the dissolution of their, arrangement.
Right.
But I mean, Mark is deeply changed by the end of this book. Like at the beginning of this book, he's all, I'm a loner, I'm a rebel. I'll never have love. I'll never be in a long-term relationship. For the lion's share of the book, his entire plan is to get the letter and ruin Charlotte anyway.
And he was basically like, look, she's collateral damage, but I am going to escape this trap that I've on my leg, right?
He needs to be turned around.
Right.
And it's remarkable because you don't actually these days, you're right. Right now we're going through a time in romance where the heroes are not ships to be turned around.
Right.
They're already on page at the beginning, mostly decent.
Right.
And in this case, Mark isn't that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing that I think so I just, there's like one other thing that really like moved me in this book, which is in the end when they, she like literally Passion's like, look, I've told you have to marry Charlotte, but I actually cannot stick around to watch you do this. So I'm going to head home and, kind of tell my dad.
Fair. Also increasing.
Yes, I'm pregnant. So I'm going to keep going, Dad, but I just wanted you to know. And Mark, finds her. I mean, he's essentially like still in his wedding clothes. Of course, they don't, he's not married. Charlotte's like, I actually think I could do better.
Cravat undone.
Oh, yeah. He's a rumpled mess.
Mess. Hasn't shaved.
And, they go out. They go take a walk. And it's what's really, like, they essentially, like, make vows to each other. And even though it is not called a wedding, even though it is not, like the word vow is not used, it's really clear that like they are promising themselves to each other in a way that both of them consider holy, literally. And I found myself really won over by this aspect of the book where it was like, here, an inspirational romance does not have to be, divorced from like this physical relationship or like what I mean? It was deeply spiritual in this moment. Like probably the best romance wedding I've ever seen on page in some ways is this one where it wasn't a wedding at all, but it was them saying like, you are the most important person to me and we are going to promise to be together. And, and he says like, I shall spend all my days with you and enjoy 1,000 small moments in each one. It's beautiful.
It's lovely.
It really is. What a book.
It's really, I've reread it a number of times and it's really great. It's I think partially because of it, the balance between this kind of really intense emotional love story and the wild bananas physicality of it. It's cognitively dissonant in a lot of ways. And I love it for that. I love it for, here is a person, again, we've talked about this as like debut novels, right?
Yeah, right.
This feels so much like a debut, like a great debut. And if you were going to make a list of like the 10 best debut romances, this surely would be on it because it feels like she didn't know the rules. And I use rules with like quotation marks, right? Like she didn't know all the ways that this book shouldn't work. And so she just wrote it and it works. And I don't know, Lisa Valdez, if you're out there, stop listening to all those other people because we think you're pretty great.
What about Primrose? Well, and I also assume that Charlotte and Captain, what's his name, her little friend.
Yeah.
we're going to get together.
I mean, there was some really, there was that decent, John is really decent. I mean, there are some decent people.
Well, that's the one I thought would get
John.
together with Charlotte. Yeah, John, sure. What a name.
Matthew, Mark, John.
The theme is clear.
Classics for a reason. I don't know. So then after this, you can read Patience, which is about Matt basically dominating Patience.
I mean, and Matthew is like a fascinating character in his own right.
Yeah, because we watch him fall in this book.
Yes.
And then in Patience, where he was a like kind of happy-go-lucky, like beta-y character in this book, in Patience, he is like...
Yeah, different.
Hyperdom.
I feel like I'm trying to think if there's like other... I mean, this book was full of...
There's a moment of sister weirdness.
So I actually have So basically the sisters are all like skinny dipping because it was hot. And they all are like...
in the past.
Yeah, in the past when they were like teenagers. And then it's kind of like they all are like checking each other's quims out, if I'm going to use the word. And I just kind of was like, I always assumed that this is essentially like, there was no internet. There was no Scarletine. Who's going to teach you stuff about your bodies if it's not going to be your sisters? I don't know. I didn't really have a problem with it. I was like, sure, somebody's got to tell you.
And it's fine. It's just, another moment of like, that wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Outside of erotic.
Oh, yeah, completely not. Well, even Mark's, I mean, but I felt like what was interesting to me about that was there's pretty extensive description of the kind of shenanigans Mark and his brother got up to at boarding school, right? Mm-hmm. Like measuring each other and compared to everybody else count. And how much, who could fill up
semen quantities.
Yeah, like who could shoot it further across the room. And
listen,
and I was kind of like...
This is why Jennifer Porter loves this book. There's a lot of semen talk.
But I was kind of like, if that is... normal, or we're kind of like, I could see, guys, quote unquote, doing that. Why is it any less weird to think about girls sitting around and being like, hey, here's how my body works? I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting the way with it, like in the absence of sex ed, how do people find out anything? Right. Yeah. I mean, even Passion, who was married for several years.
Well, but never took her clothes off. I mean, this is
right. I was never naked.
Classic.
Yeah.
It's a classic. Like, I'm a widow. Like, she's basically a virgin widow.
Right.
I mean,
right. He just came and did his duty, but it was never.
Like, I don't know what was going on down there.
Yeah. Right. And that, I think, is also a commentary just on, I was very interested, I guess, in that aspect of it. Like, how do you know what you know? How do you know what you're capable of? How do you love your body and what it can do or not do? Those were like really interesting questions to me in this book as I read it this time.
Yeah. I think when we talked about sports romances, whenever we talked about sports romances, you have talked about this body thing before, that like sex and sports romances should kind of be astronomically good because here are these people who can literally make their bodies do anything.
Right.
And so maybe, your point about the body being so present here is also a little bit that. It's a little bit like in the hands of the right person, your body can do remarkable things.
Right.
Because so can your heart, so can your mind. So
right. I guess, that's what I mean.
You can achieve, like, love beyond measure and then also literal vagina beyond measure.
And there you go. Scene. But, I mean, I think, whether or not I think that's true, I do think that this book makes a really compelling case for, like, erotic romance being about the person where, like, your heart and your mind and your soul are, like, the closest together, right? Like they're one, literally. You can't divorce those things from each other in a great erotic romance. That's what I think I came away thinking in this book.
It's interesting. It does kind of sets a new level of what an erotic should be.
Well, I think in every really good one.
I think it's also really interesting that it does it without, at this point in time, it sort of predates, after 50 Shades came out, there was just that explosion of erotics where every heroine was innocent and tied up.
Yes.
And every hero was like wildly experienced dom.
Right.
And this doesn't ever touch it. She never...
No.
There is obviously a sense that Passion did not have a sexually, rewarding marriage.
Right.
But she's not stupid about it. Like, she's not innocent about it. And I think there's something really interesting about that, too. Like, this is I don't know, there's so much that's sort of revolutionary about the way Passion is written.
Yeah. Yeah.
The book and the character, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I feel a little like it's calling its shot. I don't think there's anything, you name a character Passion because of Passion Sunday, that's like the reason for it. But this is like her, and then it's like, this is an untapped part of me I've never really discovered. And I think there's something beautiful to the idea that even though this is like super over the top, that like when you fall in love or when you find someone that is like a perfect match for you, whether it be like a romantic relationship or not, that you're going to like discover something in yourself that you hadn't brought forth before.
Yeah.
And not in an amazing way, just that like we're all capable of so much more than we ever really thought we were. And sometimes the right person comes along at the right time and you see what that is. And that's true for both of them.
I'm really glad we did this one because I think it often gets sort of laughed off. But it exists in romance history for a reason.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read it, everyone, now you know what you're in for. You can then follow it with patience. And Lisa Valdez also has a short story called The Tower, which is a retelling of Rapunzel, which I remember reading and liking. So that's Lisa Valdez. If you're listening, Lisa, and you'd like to come on Fated Mates, we'd love to have you. We'll keep all your secrets. Okay, what else is there to say? It's 2022.
It's 2022.
You can find us at fatedmates.net. You can find us on Twitter at fatedmates, on Instagram at fatedmatespod. Our next read along, do we know?
No.
We don't know.
Sorry. Check show notes. We'll decide after.
Well, listen, here's the deal. I'm moving.
Right. It's actually not going to be
Monroe.
for a while.
It's Monroe.
Oh, of course. Duh.
It's Monroe, you guys.
It's Monroe. Sure.
Cressley Cole's Monroe, for those of you who didn't listen to us for the first season, we haven't read it yet, but we don't recommend starting with Monroe.
No.
We have a plan for the Monroe episode, which we haven't announced yet, but we will announce, so stay tuned for that. But that is the next read-along for those of you who are Cressley Cole fans. There will be another, read-along in the future after we sort out January, which is a lot.
Sarah's moving. It's a lot. So we are going to have an interstitial. We're going to have a couple of Trailblazers. We're going to have Monroe. We have some cool stuff. Yeah, but I think the next 6 weeks, Monroe's the next read along, and then we'll decide what's after that.
What we will put on Twitter, though, and I will do it for we'll do it for Instagram and Twitter, and I'm making this promise without talking to Jen, but I am going to make you a list of the 4 or 5 places that we think you can jump into Immortals After Dark. If you're not in the market for 18 straight books, which, it's Fair. 2022 and who knows what's coming. But there are logical and reasonable on-ramps to the series, and we will do a quick post on both of those places and maybe even put it in show notes where you can start if you want to just get a little sense of what's going on.
Yes, agree. All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Bye.